Welcome to Deep Transformation, Self-Society Spirit. I'm Roger Walsh, and our co-host is John Dupuy, author of the book Integral Recovery and founder of the movement of the same name, Integral Recovery. Also CEO of iAwake Technologies, the company which makes soundtracks to support meditation and which supports this podcast. And our guest today is Connie Zweig, and it says a lot about how highly we hold Connie in esteem that she's our first ever return guest. And she's returning because she has recently done another book, a beautiful text, Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, the Dance of Darkness and Light in Our Search for Awakening. A beautiful title and a beautiful book. And Connie, this is not Connie's first book by any means. Connie is the author of the best-selling work, The Inner Work of Age. And she also authored a novel about the life of Rumi. And now she returns to what has been a central theme through much of her work, exploring the shadow. And Connie, I've heard you described as the queen of shadow. So what brought you to this topic?
Hi, Roger. Hi, John. Thank you so much for having me back. Really eager for our conversation. So very early in my career in publishing, actually, before I became a psychologist, I put together a collection called Meeting the Shadow, and it happened to really strike a chord. People seemed to want to understand what was going on in the unconscious, why they were sabotaging their own intentions with self-destructive behaviors or repetitive patterns, bad choices. And then when I went to grad school, I wanted to write my dissertation about spiritual longing. I had already been meditating for a long time, and I wanted to explore the psychology of spiritual yearning. And I found the poem by Goethe called The Holy Longing, and that became the subject of the dissertation, looking at what Freud and Jung and Wilber and others had to say about our yearning for transcendence, for the divine. And then I wrote Romancing the Shadow, which was an offering of a method to work with unconscious material, to take that sort of abstract, amorphous shadow content and form it into personal figures that we could begin to establish conscious relationships with, so that that shadow material moved into our awareness and we could begin to do shadow work. And so all of this was going on while I was doing clinical work and doing my own psychological work and spiritual practice. And then I turned the dissertation into a book that was called The Holy Longing. And many years later, I did The Inner Work of Age. And, you know, Roger, it's not a change of subject. It's very much about meeting the shadows of age, exploring the unconscious process, the denial, the self-hatred, the projections that go on as we age. So even though the title doesn't have that word in it, because the publisher didn't want that, it's still, you know, it carries this thread, which is my soul's mission, really. And then this publisher, who I've had a wonderful experience with, asked me for a revision of The Holy Longing. And so this will be now, I think it's the 6th book. It's very revised and updated from the earlier edition because so much has happened in the world of psychology and spirituality. So much has taken place. And so I wanted to look at why it is, once again, that we meet darkness on the path. that we believe when we enter spiritual life, when we find a teacher, when we find a practice, that it will be all light and bliss and easy rolling. And instead, what happens is, we come up against our own issues. We come up against our unresolved problems and suffering. And we also come up against our teachers' unresolved problems, neuroses, complexes. We come up against community issues, group processes that create difficulties, challenges, suffering for us. And what is that about? And I really looked at the literature and tried to see who was writing about that. And nobody was really writing about it from a depth psychological point of view, which is to say, from the point of view of the unconscious, the shadow. So what are the shadows that we meet in our spiritual lives? How do we work with them? And how do we understand, how do we kind of come to understand with the maturation of our spiritual lives that the shadow is part of the journey?
Yeah. And Connie, shadow has become somewhat of it's becoming a kind of more popular term, for better and worse. And shadow, as it was originally formulated by Jung, was a very precise term. Now it's become often used to imply anything negative that arises. And so maybe you could say a bit about how you're using it in this book.
Yeah, that's important, Roger. That's really important so that we're all on the same page. So Jung coined the term shadow to mean those parts of us, feelings, behaviors, attitudes that are outside of the boundaries of awareness. So the persona, or what we call the ego, is the conscious personality that we act out. But the ego develops because there are certain parts of us that don't develop in tandem. So let's say when we're growing up, we're not allowed to express anger. All that charge, that energy goes into the shadow. We develop a polite, kind personality because that's what's rewarded with love. That's what's praised. But it's the negative traits that we think are in the shadow are only negative in relation to ego. So if, for example, we're growing up in a family that says athletics is a waste of time, you have to focus on academic achievement, but our gifts are athleticism, sports, some particular sport that we're really gifted at, and it's forbidden in our family, then that talent, or it could be artistic talent, is disdained. That talent goes into the shadow. And so all of our gifts that are unlived are in the shadow as well. And that was a step that Jung took away from Freud, where he recognized that the unconscious is not only about sexuality and aggression. Anything can become unconscious as we develop from babies and children and teens into adults. And so, as we age, many people who have a midlife crisis want to start living out some of the qualities that were buried and lost in the unconscious. And that's part of what midlife is about, right? It's about discovering the unlived life. And they're not all, quote, negative traits or feelings. Some of them might be sadness. If, like, my father used to tell me it made him unhappy if I was sad. And so I learned not to show that to him as a child. And so the full range of my emotional expression was limited by that adaptation. So now I can express grief and sorrow and sadness about all kinds of things as part of my aliveness.
Beautiful. And there's a key question that immediately comes to mind here, which is, why don't we recognize the shadow? And particularly for people, and many of our audience are involved in contemplative practices, the honing and refining of awareness, the training of attention, bringing awareness and attention to levels which actually the psychological research shows is beyond what was thought possible. So we have this, it's possible through meditation to develop incredible sensitivity of perception and introspection and acuity to the finest things. And yet, there are big parts of our psyche which don't show up. How come?
Well, by definition, the shadow is hidden. It's denied, it's forbidden, it's unwelcome, it's unacceptable by definition. And so even as we develop spiritually, even as we evolve and our consciousness expands, there is still shadow material locked into the body-mind. Locked in, Freud and Jung didn't realize the body-mind connection. So they thought it was like some corner of the psyche in the brain. But it's actually the full body-mind contains material that's repressed in the muscles, in the nerves, in the belly, in the throat. And so it's by definition outside of our awareness. And so if we are doing practices from traditions that don't include some kind of inner work to uncover that, or even more so, actually forbid that, like let's say sexual feelings. So if we're in monastic traditions, sexual feelings are not encouraged and maybe they're even shamed. And so that material remains buried. It remains unconscious, or aggression might remain unconscious, or anger, because
I'm sorry, Connie, but what is the danger then? We're talking about the kind of negative shadow, and I want to get onto the unlived gifts too. So we're holding all this back, say we're the monk, and we have all these sexual longings and stuff, and we just stuff that down. What is the danger? But then what happens?
Well, I think that's really individual, John. It's hard to generalize. But if we look at the Catholic Church childhood sexual abuse scandal, how do we explain that hundreds, maybe thousands of priests who were celibate acted out in that way? How do we explain that? How do we understand that? What were the needs inside of that sexual enactment of abuse? What were the deep needs there around remaining celibate, or in some cases being gay and not being allowed to express that by the church? So that's kind of a dramatic and collective example. But there are individual risks that in chapter 5 in the new book, I go through many, many dozens of stories with allegations of spiritual teachers from Eastern traditions who are acting out sexual violations, abuse of power, verbal abuse, emotional coercion, financial coercion. Why? Why is that happening? This is what I'm trying to understand. What is being repressed into the shadow that erupts in these ways that are so harmful? Even people who've taken vows to do no harm. Why is that happening? Because it's happening in epidemic proportions now. These are not isolated events. And and we can talk about what are the risks for seekers or believers or students, and what are the risks for teachers and clergy as well. Because there's a climate right now in which the shadow is erupting in our culture. In the headlines, we see it every day. In the political, the whole Trump drama has kept it in our faces, right? But it's not so much in the headlines in the spiritual domain, and yet it's there in great numbers. And
Yeah, in your book, you call it the eruption of the shadow going on right now, which I thought was very well said and tragically true.
Yeah.
But I wonder, is Connie, it seemed like there was an implication in what you just said that that there in the word eruption, that there was something new here. And I wonder if these aren't perennial issues.
I don't think it's new. I think what's new is that we're seeing it so
Yes.
widely because of social media, because of the loss of privacy, because of more people's capacity to speak out since the Me Too movement. I think we're seeing it more in Hollywood, in politics, in Congress, but I really hadn't seen much written about the spiritual arena and this topic. And so I'm kind of wanting to translate this, language of the headlines into our most sacred world, our world of spirit.
And also to do it in considerably greater depth, because the headlines are sensationalistic and usually very superficial. And the gift of your book is that you have both your deep, long-term spiritual practice and contemplative reflection, plus your deep psychological, particularly Jungian training and reflection and practice. I want to make sure we don't lose something here, because I was particularly I asked about why don't we recognize our own shadow, and you gave some responses, but there's one thing you didn't mention. I know you know this, but it seems so important. I want to bring it up for you to comment on, and that is the unconscious is really unconscious, and it is one of the things I find most striking in comparing the world's contemplative traditions with their thousands of years of profound investigation and nurturing of the psyche and our potentials, etc. Yet nowhere do you find an account of what we now call psychodynamics and psychological defense mechanisms. That is, they don't show up to introspection, but they do show up very clearly in our interpersonal relationships, which is why the psychotherapy emerged and particularly began flourishing with Freud's recognition of psychological defenses and mapping of those. And it's interesting, they can, they're clear. It's much easier to see other people's defenses than it is our own. And actually, 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, why don't you see the log or the beam of wood in your own eye when you see the splinter in your brother's so clearly? Well, we can answer him now. Psychological defenses.
Yes. Well, there, as you know, as one of the founders of transpersonal psychology, Roger, there has been this split between the psychological world and the spiritual world. And they've only come together in recent decades with ATP and integral. So most of the ancient teachings don't include what we would call psychodynamics. I think that there are some perhaps insights into what we would now call the psyche in some of the wisdom teachings. You probably know better than I do where they lie. Certainly Buddhism has insight into how the mind works and how it protects itself. I think that there are insights about that in the Vedas, but they don't explain projection. They don't explain repression, right? They don't explain denial, the basic things that we take for granted now in understanding ourselves. And I would say, in response to your comment about they're not available for self-reflection, those defenses, there are ways to work with the unconscious, such as dream work, So what started me on the path of exploring the shadow was a dream that I had when I was in Jungian analysis. And talking with this analyst for weeks about this dream about my shadow. And it opened a universe to me that I, knew nothing about. So there are ways now of finding access to the deeper unconscious that we are now privileged to, just as we're privileged to all of the spiritual practices that weren't available before. So we kind of live in this moment where that's all open to us now.
Yeah, I wanted to maybe, Roger, I'm honored to be here with both of you. So much to give, but perhaps this a lack of introspection that we see throughout in the Christianity, we said it with demons and devils, and we gave it an exterior force of being attacked and exorcisms to get these parts out. But you think it may be developmental? In other words, human beings have to get to a certain developmental level before they can really begin the task of introspection. And you may not see the shadow, but you start to see clues. Why do I get so angry when this happens? Why am I attracted sexually to this? That's so weird. Or, why do I want to be violent or steal? Or why am I attracted to just hurtful behaviors? And perhaps it's because more of us are arriving. This is part of the picture here at these developmental levels that hadn't been available to most of us for a long, long time, that now we can begin to see it. And I think being confronted with the worldwide shadow because of our internet and all this stuff, perhaps those two forces start bringing it out in us individually.
Yeah, and some of that development is due to how many people have been doing psychotherapy and psychological inner work, as well as spiritual inner work. So we start to see it in the results of our behavior. We start to cultivate self-observation. I think that's what you're saying. We start to see the results of our actions, whether we hurt ourselves or hurt someone else, whether we have a compulsion that's hurting ourselves, or we have an addiction, or we have some kind of repeating pattern of always getting in destructive relationships, as an example. And that self-observation is the beginning. It's the beginning of asking the question, who is doing that? Who in me or what in me is making that happen? And that sort of turns the arrow inward rather than outward in blame and projection. And that's a huge developmental step. I mean, I think, unfortunately, most of humanity is lost in projection and not turning inward yet. But I do agree with you that there are certain, portions of the population that are doing that developmentally, and that's a giant leap. It's a giant leap for humanity.
And a large part of your book is about, this book, Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, is about the way the shadow manifests, the way it sidetracks us, and the ways we can recognize it. But you also point to ways we can protect ourselves against it. And I'd love to, that's obviously a crucial question.
How do you mean, Roger? Protect ourselves internally or
well, it's an open question. I'm thinking both how can we protect ourselves against our expression of it. I'm thinking both individually and in groups and in our role, the various professional roles, and particularly in the roles of spiritual teachers.
Okay. So it's funny, the question didn't compute because the word protect doesn't come up for me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't frame it that way. So that's interesting. So, this book is a call for spiritual awakening. It's a call for commitment to and deepening of our practices. but it's also a call to shadow awareness. And for me, shadow awareness is a relative kind of waking up. It's becoming aware of those parts of ourselves that we're discussing right now that have been outside of our awareness, but have been sabotaging our conscious desires, or hurting people we love, or harming ourselves in some way. How do we become aware of those shadows? And then how do we become aware of the shadows in others? So shadow awareness includes recognizing our projections. So we tend to think about projections as negative, right? We project, oh, she's so lazy, she doesn't get off the couch. Or he's so angry, he's always mean, right? We tend to imagine that we're projecting negative traits when we think about projection. But we can also project the light, spirituality, spiritual essence, whatever we call it, Buddha nature, Christ nature. We can also project that onto other people in the attempt to make a human being divine, and therefore worthy of our idealization. And so as we idealize charismatic leaders, there's a dynamic that starts to happen. And it's very tricky to talk about this with people who are in, devotional teacher-disciple relationships, or clergy, people who are in discipleships with clergy who are believed to be ordained by God. I mean, this is a very tricky thing to talk about, right? So the book is about what is it in us that wants to make a human divine? Because every human, as we were saying, still has shadow, still has flaws, unconscious material, needs, unhealed wounds. And those parts of the teacher or clergy person may erupt, to use that word, John, may act out in ways that are tricky or hurtful or risky or difficult. So the psychodynamics of that relationship are similar to the therapist-client relationship, in the sense that we may, psychodynamically, if we were Freudians, we might say that we are projecting or unconsciously attributing to the teacher a parental nature. This is the father I never had. He's safe, he's unconditionally loving, he'll never hurt me. And that child part of us attributes to that teacher, a male in this case, that unconditional father. And then what happens when some aspect of that teacher violates that projection? Either the projection pops, the student sees through it and says, okay, I gotta rethink this. Do I separate from the teacher and leave the community? Do I speak up and try to get the systems to change here? Or do I just accept? Do I stay silent and just accept? Surrender. Most important thing is my surrender, not my ego. So I'm going to stay and suck it up. And if he's doing that and he's perfect, then it must be right. If he's abusing that young woman, she must deserve it. It's her karma. And so all these spiritual rationalizations start to arise. Why? To keep that projection intact, to keep that father-child dynamic going and safe. And so the mind makes up all sorts of stuff about it to rewrite it. And then Jung went beyond Freud here and said, there's an archetypal projection. It's not only the parent we're projecting, it's the God. we're attributing a godlike power to that person. And that's why that person seems to have impunity, seems to be able to do anything and be untouched by it. And there's a lot of this going on with Trump acolytes.
Oh boy, that's true.
Yeah, right?
But
So
Connie, I have a pressing question. I'm sorry, you're in such a zone, but I want to kind of go back to that. We see this dynamic a lot. I was in a cult when I was a teenager. Okay, I really get that. But what does it say about the person that is the object of these projections and realizes it? And you very clearly, you said in your book that, and this is a super important point, I think, is that a person can be at whatever level of spiritual development and still be a sociopath. So maybe that's A and B, that question. What does it say about the person who's accepting these projections and taking it to the bank, so to speak, or fulfilling their desires? And what do you mean? You're enlightened, you get non-duality and all of this, and there's no compassion, you're still a sociopath?
Okay.
You know, this is huge.
So the risk goes both ways, right? So I was describing the risk to the student or believer or practitioner. There's also a risk to the teacher or clergy person. I mean, imagine being someone who has millions of followers, who have blind faith in you, either because of your birth into a lineage or because of some demonstration of powers, or because of your claim for a certain level of awakening. So all of these people, and it could be around the world, you know, could be local, focused on, or it could be non-local around the world. And they're all projecting onto you that you're perfect, that you're flawless, that you're XYZ. And I would say that the traits that they're projecting arise from their own needs, from what the ideal parent, teacher, God is to them, right? That's what they're projecting, that's what they're giving away. So imagine being the recipient of that. So you come to believe, and in some cases, the scriptures say, you reach this stage of awareness, you can do no wrong, because you're not the doer anymore. And all those moral, ethical rules don't apply anymore because they're just concepts, they're empty. And so you're free. You can do what you want, and the people believe you can walk down Fifth Avenue and shoot someone, right? Because you're immune to the consequences that everybody else is subject to. And so what happens if you're in that position, and let's say maybe you've had some state experience of awakening, or maybe you haven't, and you're just, you're just fooling, the whole thing is a lie, but maybe you have, and then it passed, but you think that's who I am. I don't have to do any more inner work because I've already attained what I was looking for, right? So what happens then to the psychological wounds that remain? Maybe it's a personality disorder, like you said. We see so much narcissism among spiritual teachers, and it hurts me to say that. But if we look at the definition of narcissism, we see it everywhere in spiritual communities.
Connie, I want to push you to be precise, because I would disagree. We don't see it everywhere, but we see it too much.
We see it too much. Thank you. That's fine. That's fine. I don't mean to smear everybody with the same statement. Good. Okay. So we see it too much, but I'm asking why? Because one reason we could say is because of spiritual bypass, right? The psychological work has not been completed, although some spiritual state was attained, maybe for a moment, maybe for 3 years. Okay, that's one reason. Another reason is There's shadow material. You know, Ken Wilber made this great point in Religions of Tomorrow, that there's shadow material in every chakra. So you can have very high states and still have shadow material in your sexual chakra. Maybe you are a teacher who comes from an Eastern tradition where monasticism was at play. You come from a monastery, or you were taught that, you know, because of your birth, you're so special and you're above everyone else, or whatever the historical explanation. That teacher still has some sexual, we could call it karma, or injury, or shadow material, whatever we call it, and comes to the West, and all these women are half dressed and liberated and, you know, free and want to be dancing and blissed out. And so he's tempted. So, you know, and again, Roger, you're right. It's not everybody, but there's a lot of disappointing reports about teachers acting out in ways that are very unconscious.
And do you think that the teachers begin, they kind of know it's BS, but at a certain point, you get all this energy focused on you and you begin to believe your own BS. You know, you begin to believe your own propaganda. You're, well, maybe I am perfect. And I want to, you know, have sex with that young woman because, well, she needs me to transmit, you know, this great awareness that everybody says I have. And I'm pretty smart. I am. So maybe everything I do is just teaching them. And so I just need to let this spirit of my wonderfulness come through me and do what I do.
Yeah, so there are all kinds of self-explanations for the behavior. You know, I can transmit my Kundalini through sex and wake you up. You know, that was a common one for a while. Or if you don't give me sex, you know, your family is going to go to hell, and or be reincarnated in a bad lifetime or whatever. So these stories start to come around the abuse to rationalize it and to control people.
And they swear at secrecy too. You can't tell anybody because this is our special God-given gift. There's a whole.
And the secrecy is the glue that holds it all together in the community. People don't want to tell on each other and don't want to lose their special relationship to the special teacher.
Yeah. And you implied something there, Connie, and you too, John, that there are certain aspects or characteristics of groups and teachers that are most likely to get into trouble. And we probably should mention, along with your book, Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path is an excellent one that Ken Wilber and others edited on spiritual choices, in which they examined the characteristics of spiritual groups which either protected or led to problems. And one directly relates to what both of you were talking about, which is the difference between, for example, what they called charismatic and technical leaders and groups. Charismatic, in which the idea was that the benefit came from the teacher, from being in the company of the transmission of the teacher, versus technical, the oriented groups where the benefits came from a practice, from training one's heart, mind, and cultivating one's character, etc. And not surprisingly, the charismatic groups are much more likely to run awry than the technical ones. So those
Really
are some
good point.
characteristics.
Yes, really good point. So the question there that I hear is, when does a community become cult-like? What leads a spiritual or religious community to become cult-like? And I don't mean become a cult in a classical sense, but to become cult-like, where everyone has to think the same way, feel the same way. I remember when I started meditating in my early 20s, and someone said to me, "Why do you always have this silly smile on your face?" And I realized I was developing a spiritual persona. And it kind of reinforced that story I got from my father about not showing any sadness, right? It fit right in. You know, I was wanting to be blissed out, and so I was looking like I was blissed out. It was very unconscious. I didn't know that was happening. So when does a group begin to reinforce certain subtle dynamics so much that people begin to lose their critical thinking and their agency?
Yeah, and and there've been some research on this, some studies, and you've already pointed to one of the things, which is secrecy, which is a key thing. So that's certainly one of the characteristics. Dominator hierarchies are clearly another, and the belief in infallibility is another, and the belief in the importance of the work we are doing and we are chosen to do, etc. I had the privilege, along with my late wife Frances, being in a group that was doing research on cults, and led to the work, the book Spiritual Choices. And what struck me was, as we interviewed people from various cults, was, first off, I could no longer pretend that this couldn't happen to me. Some of these people were really smart. Some of them were psychologists. Some of them were even depth psychologists. And yet they fell for it. So there's no way I could pretend I couldn't. But the three things which really struck me was that, first, the real danger signs was, one, we are doing uniquely important work, and therefore whatever we do, we can justify it. The second was, the first ethical misstep, the second one comes so much more easily. And let's see, what was the third? I'm forgetting the third thing that really struck me. But those two certainly remain in my memory. So there's certain characteristics of groups. Yeah, go ahead, John. Sorry.
I'm glad that you said, not every spiritual teacher is like that. That's a very important point. And we have our next talk is going to be our second talk with Hamid H.A.H. Almas. Yeah. And I've known people that have been in the Diamond Approach for decades. And after I joined one cult, I joined the Army. But anyway, after that, I didn't join much. And I've watched the way, even in his small groups, he always has two teachers there so they can kind of keep each other in check, as a safety mechanism. And I've got like major cult dar, right, from my early experience. I can sense it out. But, I really think this guy's the real deal. He's so brilliant, so unself-glorifying. It comes through in this beautiful vehicle. He's just a down-to-earth, very gifted guy. And anyway, it's been healing for me to be just hanging out with these people.
John, Hamid is really rooted in psychology. I mean, he has really bridged psychodynamics and different spiritual traditions in a way that most of the teachers haven't. And I think that gives him a groundedness in the dynamics that is different from people who aren't educated in that way.
Well, there are people who are and are still cult leaders, and they know all that stuff. They just
that's true.
They go with inflation,
Yeah, that's true. Look at that Nixium guy. He was really using psychology. Keith Raniere. Yeah, that's true.
Connie, you pointed to something which you didn't flesh out. I'd love to have you go back to it, and that is, you're talking about, of course, you're making a very important point that all of us have shadows, and probably have shadows no matter how much work we do of every kind, psychological, spiritual, etc., etc. They're always, the psyche seems to be boundless, and there seems to be no end to the ways it can hide from itself. So But you also emphasized that the dangers of acting out our shadow material go up when we're in positions of power. And you kind of pointed to, but I'd love to hear you speak more to, the particular traps that come with some spiritual traditions, where there, I think particularly of the tantric traditions, and tantra is a lot more than sexuality, which is what Westerners tend to associate it with. It's a very powerful and profound set of traditions. But in some traditions, there's a deliberate practice of seeing the guru as a profoundly awakened person, and using that as a practice. So which is easy in the current climate for us to completely dismiss, yet for centuries it's been valued as a spiritual practice. Love to hear you reflect on this.
You know, it's really complex, and I don't want to come across as a black and white thinker here, in which I'm saying all teacher-student relationships are bad. That's not what I'm saying.
And I want to say that one of the things I really value about your book, Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path, is you are not doing a black and white thing. You are very nuanced and very open to multiple perspectives. I think it's one of the great strengths of the book.
Thank you, Roger. Yeah, I'm not saying, always leave your teacher, get out of there and go back to normal, which is what the anti-cult people are saying, right? So I'm not encouraging people to go back to normal, whatever that is.
Yeah, normal is probably not the right word here, but
well,
still,
go back to
the conventional.
The conventional, thank you. Yeah, that's not what I'm saying. So, I really believe that there are times in each of our lives when we need guides, external and internal guides. And if the guide appears in the form of a human teacher, and that serves us for a certain period of time, and the practices involve guru worship or idealization or visualization practices of internalizing that person or internalizing inner gods and goddesses, then that's what that moment is about for you. And if in that situation the shadow shows up, then that's part of the path. And if it doesn't show up, and that kind of works developmentally in a continuing way, then that's okay. And I would add, cultivate shadow awareness so that you can reduce the risk for everyone involved. And what do I mean by that? So some of us get information through our bodies. We get bodily cues about something's off, in my stomach. Some of us get intuitions, a sense that there's danger or someone's not telling the truth. Some of us have internal dialogue. It might come in the form of a doubt or a question. Maybe it's a forbidden question. Oh, I can't ask that. It's too dangerous.
Or maybe the rational mind also starts.
So I would suggest that we pay attention to those cues because they're coming from a deeper level than the rational mind. They're coming from a deeper level than conscious awareness with messages about the circumstance that we're in and the people we're with. So for me, I started transcendental meditation at 19 for no holy reason, really, but because I wanted to date a guy in Berkeley who wouldn't date me if I didn't meditate. And it changed my whole life. And
God works in mysterious ways.
right? And I entered that meditation community very naive and kind of wide open. But my nature is not devotional. And for me, it wasn't about Maharishi, it was about the practice, like this distinction that you just made, Roger. And I stayed and I watched and I learned how to be a teacher. And after about 10 years, alarms started going off. And I buried them for a while. I took the doubt and I repressed it. I took the perceptions of, my sense that people were lying about their spiritual experiences to get advanced practices, and I stuffed it. And after a while, I couldn't stuff it anymore. And after a decade, I left the TM community and I was bereft. I lost all my friends. They wouldn't speak to me. I lost my meaning and my practice and my teacher and everything. And that in some way is the root experience of this book, because I know that there are millions of people with that experience, whether in a synagogue or a church or, an Eastern tradition with a teacher. Those red flags are hard to pay attention to when you're so invested in a belief system and a teacher and a community. Now, the good news is it led me to all kinds of other wonderful teachers and practices. It didn't shut me down and turn me off, which is what happens to so many people. So the book is about, for people who have been disillusioned like that in some way, whatever the context, if you've been disillusioned, if you feel like you've lost faith, if you feel like you've been religiously abused or spiritually abused, this is how to rekindle your inspiration. It's not how to give up and be a rational, conventional person. That's not what I'm saying. And go back to normal, as I said. It's about how to bring shadow awareness to your spiritual life to enhance it.
And Connie, how long did it take you when you left your community to kind of, get over the grief and the sense of, betrayal or blaming yourself or a lot of the stuff that happens? Was that a gradual process? Did it take 6 months, a year? When you went, okay, I see what happened, but now I'm firmly back on the path, and the stuff that I wanted originally is revealing itself to me in new ways, perhaps.
And what did you do to help that happen?
Well, again, these are really individual stories. So the way that it unfolded for me may be really different than how it unfolds for other people, right? So for me, Roger, I think you know this. I read The Aquarian Conspiracy. I was living alone. I didn't have friends because I lost them. I was very disoriented. I read this book, The Aquarian Conspiracy, in 1981. That was sort of the first big book about the New Age by Marilyn Ferguson. And I did something that I had never, ever done in my life. I picked up the phone and called the author. And she said, "Oh my God, my editor just left. I don't care who you are. This is synchronicity. Come in. I want to give you a job." And she became my writing mentor and opened up another career for me. So, it's a kind of, the individual details may not be repeated in other people's lives, but the pattern of letting go, really taking the risk of stepping into the liminality and the uncertainty and the not knowing what's next, and trusting life that something will show up for you. It's like leaving a marriage or leaving anything that you're really, that that you know you're at the end of, that you know isn't feeding you, and you're hanging on because you don't know what else there is, and letting go and stepping into that liminal space. And my writing mentor showed up and completely changed my life. So, you know, and she used to make fun of me and call me the yogi and all this stuff and tease me about it. But I stayed with meditation. I found other meditation practices. I stayed with them. For me, they weren't guru-centered because that's just not my way. I have had teachers, but not a devotional relationship like other people do. So I think what I'm trying to say with the book is that we need to hold both. We need to follow that yearning for transcendence beyond the ego. We need to follow that. We need to hear that whisper and let it guide us. And at the same time, we need to beware and remember that there are dark nights on this journey, and it's a part of that for everyone. These dark nights are a part of the path. It doesn't mean you're off the path when you meet the shadow. It means that something else is required of you. Some other task is required of you at that moment. And maybe it's to meditate and do psychological work. Maybe it's to stop your spiritual practice for a while and reconnect with some emotional work or moral development or creative development. Again, this is really individual, but it's the message is that we continue to expect teachers to be infallible, and we continue to expect that our spiritual paths will not lead us to suffering, and they often do.
Wow, there's a lot in what you just said, Connie, and I want to name some of the things just to make sure they're emphasized sufficiently. One was self-trust. The things you're talking about, the steps you're talking about, the listening to those questions and doubts, and even greater, the willingness to step away from a community, etc., requires an enormous amount of self-trust. And unfortunately, pathological communities don't foster self-trust. They tend to undermine it. So self-trust is crucial. And I would say for myself on the path, one of the most recurrent recognitions has been, oh, I can trust the mind, I can trust myself. And that's absolutely crucial. Second, you made the point that encountering suffering is inevitable in any growth process. And the idea that any growth is simply going to lead to greater and greater light is just one of the real traps and mythologizing of different teachings. I mean, and, I think of classic Buddhist texts, so-and-so heard the teachings, went in the forest, meditated, got enlightened. It's like boy meets girl, ride off to the sunset, live happily ever after. If you've ever been in a relationship, something is missing from this story. So challenges, there are inevitably going to be challenges. You made the point, not in detail, but you pointed to the fact, teachers are human too. And I would say one of the danger signs is perfect teacher. There are no perfect teachers. There are just human beings who teach. And then the last thing you pointed to was feeling into what is asked of us in each situation, in each moment, at each life phase. Really important. Really important. Yeah. So beautiful. A lot of great points there.
Thank you.
Connie, can I say that I hadn't thought about that book in years, Marilyn Ferguson's book, The Aquarian Conspiracy.
Yeah.
But I was at a similar point in my life. I'd finished my bachelor's degree. I'd been in the Army, and I was still trying to figure out this whole God, truth, purpose, meaning thing. And I came to that book in some little town in Texas. And anyway, that book had a big impact on me. And it also, I think in the back, it mentioned these universities where you could study transpersonal psychology. And, that hit the light. So I went to California looking for the right school, and I went to JFK. But, God bless her. That was, we look back at now and we've learned so much and it's new age and not, but it was a very important work in its time. And it came to me, I think it just flew off the bookshelf, like one of those things, like, what?
Yes.
It really was a huge help. So God bless her. And thank you for bringing that up.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Hmm.
So let's talk about awakening, because, it's not only about the shadow, right? I mean, we all have this aspiration or this reality. Many people leave their teachers and communities because they wake up, they have some experience of union or non-duality, and they go off and become teachers, right, in their own right. And some of them will recreate the problems in their original communities, and some of them will start fresh and, do it differently. But this whole conversation that's happening now in this global spiritual, integral, non-dual community that the three of us live in, is really unique to our time. I mean, if you ever watch Buddha at the gas pump, you see all of these many, many hundreds of, and also in your podcast, many people, ordinary, people who look unassuming, having these experiences, these breakthrough experiences. And so I don't want to discourage people. The purpose of the book is not to say, oh, it's all full of shadow, forget about it. I don't want to discourage people from doing practices and from carrying this dream and keeping it alive. I live with a man who's in a very advanced stage of awareness. You would never know it by looking at him or at the way he lives his life, but his internal reality is unlimited, really, I would say. So it's very real to me. And my intention is not to discourage or, prevent people from seeking. That's not where I'm coming from.
Connie, I found it inspiring, if I can add that to the conversation. It really lit me up. I was very excited when I started reading it.
Oh, I'm glad. Yeah. So I just wanted to be sure that I said that, because, sometimes people see me as the shadow queen, and that kind of gets projected onto me as all that I'm about. And, that's just not the case.
And my sense is that actually your work and your book on meeting the shadow really are aimed at helping us move through and past the shadow issues and other issues that come up as an inevitable part of contemplative practice. And I see your book as more oriented towards fostering psychological and spiritual growth and ideally awakening, rather than in any way, putting them down.
Good. I'm glad. I'm really glad you both said that. Yeah. Because it's risky for me to focus only on the shadow. And the sort of how-to part of the book, which I call spiritual shadow work, is really about how to reclaim our projections from charismatic teachers who are acting out. And what is it that we project and banish into our own shadow and lose for ourselves? What is it that we're giving away that should really be in our own treasury? And the point of that is not just to reclaim our critical thinking or our authentic feelings or our bodily awareness so that we can then, go and have a great career. The point of that is so that we can then do our spiritual practices with all these lines of development aligned, as Wilber would say, our emotional line of development, our moral line of development, our cognitive line, and our spiritual line of development. Because these temporary states that people are glimpsing now, these spiritual states, like popcorn all over the world, people are glimpsing these non-dual states, are not enough. That's not enough. If we're not really working, doing the inner work with our other material, from my point of view.
Yeah, Connie, I don't want you to get out of here without asking you this question. And you mentioned it earlier. You talked about the shadow aspect of our unlived gifts. Could you say a bit about that?
Well, that's really what the inner work of age is about, John. It's about how to, as we move beyond midlife, let's say 50 and onward, how do we begin to uncover what we banished into the shadow that we might want to live out now? And it could be feelings or talents or aptitudes or lifestyle choices. But it's the, Jung came up with this term, the unlived life. And I think that when we recognize that we can't live out everything, we can't live out all possibilities, a certain amount of who we are is going to be not only repressed, but unexpressed. It's going to be unexpressed. And then there are moments when we can actually choose to express those things. So, for example, I've taken up knitting. Now, my husband kind of thought it was silly. He didn't get it. But for me, it's become a kind of meditative time where my mind is empty and my body is engaged, my hands are engaged, and I'm creating something. And I think this was unlived in me because my mother was an artist. You can see the painting behind me. My sister was an artist, and I didn't want to be like them. I had, these other ambitions. And so now I'm kind of living out this part of me that's craft. It's a craft, and I'm bringing who I am today to this craft and turning it into a meditative practice. So that's just, kind of one tiny example of how people can begin to express what was unlived in them.
Does it feel like you're owning an unowned part of yourself? Is
Yes.
there energy or a flow or a thank God, this is great. Just a great gratitude, I suppose, or inspiration that comes out of that.
It feels like I'm aligning more with my mother, who I rejected a lot. It feels like I'm using my whole body mind coming through my hands, which I haven't ever really experienced before. But because I've used meditation to silence my mind, I've never used a craft to do that, So it's a really different experience. And it's really been fun.
Connie, I'd love to go back to or open up a topic you pointed to as being very important, which is the idea of integrating particularly psychological approaches, psychotherapy, with contemplative work. But of course, now we are in a unique position in human history in having multiple kinds of psychological and spiritual approaches. For the first time in history, we have all the world's spiritual traditions available to us. And in addition, we have now this whole field of psychotherapy with hundreds of schools of psychotherapy. We have group processes. We have communication practices. We have psychedelics. I'd love to hear you speak about finding our way of in a mutual enhancement. How do we draw from all these most skillfully to work with shadow, but also to foster our awakening and wholeness and healing?
Big question, Roger. I think you and I have been asking that question all our lives.
Well, here's the chance to answer it.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a single answer. I know that I am very distressed about the state of the field of psychology and the medicalization that's happened and the cognitive behavioral neuroscience approach that's taken over and the neglect of unconscious process, which is now pretty established in the field. I think that both my stepson and my stepdaughter are psychologists, and my stepson was trained in CBT and neuroscience and just mocks me about the shadow. I mean, just has no ability to take it seriously that there's an unconscious. And so it's as if we work in different fields. It's not the same field, the same language, the same framework or orientation to clinical work. It's very different. And I'm distressed about the pharmaceutical industry and, how many folks are medicated now. So, and that's what is. I mean, I can't change that. That's what is. There used to be, when I went to grad school in the 90s, like you just said, John, there were a number of schools to choose from that we could call depth psychology, spiritual psychology, transpersonal psychology. There aren't now. Most of them are gone. So, so that bridge between the world of early psychodynamic depth psychology and spiritual practice, that world, I think, has best been bridged by Ken Wilber. And he has, a movement and a community of people who understand the linkages in the different lines of development, understand the necessity of focusing on all of the above, the danger of spiritual bypass, using our practices to pretend that we don't have psychological material anymore. So I don't know really of another school or community. Oh, well, Hamid Almas also is a much smaller school, but he's also building those bridges. I was in that school for 4 years and it's not my path. So I think, in terms of finding, in terms of guidance, I think that's your question, Roger. In terms of guidance, I was saying before that people can learn how to attune to themselves and listen for or feel for internal messages that can guide them. And I was talking about that in terms of shadow awareness. But we can do that same self-observation for finding a path or a teacher or a practice that fits for us. If we look for that sense of fit, when you meet someone, you feel a fit, or you find a book and you feel a fit, there is that same congruence or harmony, sense of fit that happens when you find a teacher or practice. And so we can, because everything is available now, we can experiment. We can try all kinds of different teachings and practices and see when, watch, attune in, not outward, not what people are telling you. This is the only way to heaven. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about listening to yourself and recognizing that fit. And at the same time, watching for shadow issues, watching for red flags, because you might feel a fit when, a single woman might feel a fit when she meets a man and it turns out he's an alcoholic, right? You got to watch for the shadow issues at the same time as you're just kind of following your intuition and sensing what's right for you. And also being willing to, I would say, being willing to pick up a practice without picking up the whole enchilada. So my husband has been doing inquiry practice from Almas for, I don't know how long now, many years since we left the community. He has continued that practice every day. So you can pick up what works for you without having to make a huge commitment or join something. Some people are more joiners and they want the feeling of belonging, and some people are more kind of individuated and don't want that. But you can find a practice either way. So is that useful?
Yeah, that's great. And maybe I can add a couple of things and invite further comments. But first, I want to just draw out some of the things you mentioned. You emphasized the importance again of one's own inner guidance, a felt sense of what feels right, and that implies a kind of open-mindedness as one looks to the very many things that are and approaches that are available to us now. And you imply that it's perfectly appropriate to initially take a kind of smorgasbord approach to test things, to see what feels right. And again, trusting your own intuition. And I would just add for psychotherapy, there are so many schools, but the research data is crystal clear. What is most important is the quality of the relationship. Does your relationship with this person feel good? You feel you can trust them, you can be open with them, etc. That's the most important thing, much more important than the type of therapy. And I would add that you mentioned Ken Wilber's work, very important work in integrating in a way which just hadn't been done before, both the world's contemplative traditions and the world's psychological traditions. And if we draw from that and look across the huge array of practices available to us and ask the question, well, what would an integral or comprehensive approach to growth and learning and awakening look like? It was just coming up with the following things that could be really valuable. First, a core practice of a contemplative practice of some kind, meditation, yoga. Second, reflective practices, journaling, taking time just to engage the intellect consciously. Third, psychotherapy can just be invaluable, and unfortunately it can be very expensive, but there are some less expensive alternatives, which if we can afford any type of psychotherapy, and particularly a depth psychotherapy, and particularly a therapy with a therapist who has a spiritual orientation and at least openness, that can be valuable, or at least a depth approach like Jungian. Then group work of some kind, being in groups of peers. Peers are the antidote, one of the antidotes to spiritual hierarchies and specialness, and relationships in general. If you want to have your shadow pointed out to you, get married. It's the best possible route. And the psychiatrist Arthur Dykman has had a test which has become known as the Dykman test of enlightenment. And the test is the teacher enlightened? Ask the spouse. Initially, I thought, oh, well, that's a nice joke. But the more I thought about it, the more accurate it seems. And so relationships, and then something, two other things you've mentioned, Connie. One, study, just a deep contemplative study of profound texts or psychological works can be valuable. And finally, not to forget the body, as you pointed out, that some kind of body work can be really valuable. So that's a list of 7 things: contemplative, reflection, psychotherapy, groups, relationships, study, and somatic. And of course, time is limited, but as far as I'm aware, that would be a pretty good rounded way of cultivating ourselves in multiple dimensions, guarding against the shadow, and opening our spiritual depths, and hopefully even having some tastes of awakening.
Beautiful. I love that. Now I know why you're writing a book on wisdom.
Yeah, forever.
I love that. As you were speaking, I was recalling a client who identified as Buddhist. He'd been doing Buddhist practices for many years. And as we began to do shadow work, and kind of excavate the layers of his psyche, what we uncovered was that in his Catholic childhood, he was told that sex was always bad and his sexual feelings were bad and shameful. And there was an image in his psyche that would come up, which was like a Pope-like figure shaking a finger at him, saying, bad, bad, and causing this feelings of shame that would come up when he meditated. And so, even though, and this is response to your question of the bridge between spiritual and psychological work. So even though he was doing a regular practice, underneath that, in the shadow, there was this image that was creating or stirring uncomfortable feelings and shadow material. And if he had ignored that, if he hadn't been in therapy as well as doing meditation, he wouldn't have recognized what was getting stirred up when he was meditating. And I think that, and I think that would fall under what you're calling self-reflection or inner work. You could possibly even discover that through journaling. You could discover that in a group if you were really open. And making these connections between these kind of layers of ourselves, or these separate lines of development, as Ken says, is really important, because otherwise we are at risk, as we've been saying. We are at risk of a lopsided development. And that's really not what we're looking for.
Yes, and I realized as you were talking, there's one other very important element of a rounded practice that I omitted. And since I spent years doing research on it, that's rather embarrassing. But lifestyle. One's lifestyle is crucial. Everything from time in nature to, the relationships I mentioned, but so many aspects of our lifestyles. And of course, the kind of food we eat has long been emphasized in, for example, yoga. Well, now even more than ever, that's probably important. So lifestyle is a crucial element of a well-rounded, contemplative, growth-inducing life. Yeah.
Exercise.
Exercise, indeed. The somatic side, yes. Yes.
Hey, Connie, I had a question. When I don't want to interrupt you, Roger, but
go for it, John.
Okay, and you started down this road at the beginning of the conversation, and we kind of got, we chose other rivers to flow into, but you you mentioned, the eruption of the shadow, and you mentioned Donald Trump and what's going on with our country right now. And this, for me, this is not purely academic. My people that I know that I'm very close have been hurt by this and been torn apart by this. And so, any light you can shed on the shade there would I think it would be useful. And it's just an ongoing, the gift that keeps giving. It's been he hasn't been president for, I don't know, a long time now, and it's just, and he just got indicted, got arrested the other day, went through that, and so it's just constantly Trump, and he evokes in people fierce loyalty and other stuff too that I don't completely understand. So how does your work help us to perhaps understand and be more effective in dealing with this phenomena that's not just arising in the United States, but you see with the attraction to authoritarian governments arising in democracies and things that are going on. So what can you tell us about that?
It's very analogous to what we're talking about from my point of view, because his malignant narcissism, his need for attention, his sucking up all the oxygen, whether it's good news or bad news, he's thriving in the spotlight, in some way is analogous to some teachers who are carrying the projection of their students. And I'm not saying that all of his illegal and unethical behavior is analogous. I'm saying that his psychology, his capacity to attract followers and attract loyalty through verbal abuse, through shaming. He controls people through shaming them. He's controlled the Republican Party through verbal abuse and emotional blackmail. This is some of the behavior we see in certain spiritual communities. If you don't do exactly as I say, you'll be excommunicated. You'll never be enlightened, or you will be shunned, and so this childlike part of us that wants to be the perfect follower or the good daughter or the ideal devotee is childlike. That part of us is childlike and not autonomous and not thinking independently. And all of us have that part. We used to call it the inner child, right? All of us have that part that we carry with us, and that part has unmet needs. And if that part of us thinks those needs are going to get met by this teacher or by this politician, and that person is going to save me, or that person is going to give me all the answers I've been searching for, or end all the uncertainty and provide all the meaning, because there's a religious frenzy around him. I mean, it's very analogous in certain ways. Mm. And now there's a religious frenzy building around DeSantis as well, a savior mentality. So, it's this part of us that gives away our needs to someone else, to be taken care of, and to be safe, and to be told what to do. So I think that because our culture emphasizes the heroic ego and autonomy and independence, the flip side of that in the shadow is very childlike and wants to be told what to do, wants to be dependent, wants to be taken care of. And so when we find someone to project that onto that fits the target, that wants to do that, that wants to take control, in whatever context, in whatever arena, that part of us kind of lights up. And, Roger, you mentioned that there are these guru-disciple relationships that are thousands of years, that tradition is thousands of years old. But my understanding is that there is a part of that teaching that at a certain point, guru God self, at a certain point, the teacher gives back the projection. And that part seems to have been forgotten. I don't know that I've ever seen a teacher do that. I mean, it's possible it's happened that the teacher will at some point empower. Yeah, there have been. Teachers have empowered some students to leave and go teach.
Yes.
And it seems to me that there are ways to empower students to leave and not go teach, but just go live their lives as well. Okay, I recognize you, I recognize your attainment, you have what you need, you can leave me now. And it's kind of like a parent nudging a child off to college, a bird nudging the baby out of the nest. But I don't think that happens enough. I think the dynamic gets caught in this, in the transference, in the parent-child dependency. And that's what Trump is thriving off of. He raised $7 million since his indictment 2 days ago. I mean, he is thriving off of people's dependency on him for that charge, for that energy, for that belief in him. So I hadn't planned on talking about that, but now that I'm articulating it, I can kind of see how analogous it is.
And it seems to be touching in, as you mentioned, into a very early part of the human psyche, being cared for by the parent. And that's why it seems almost impossible to rationally argue somebody out of this, because they're not doing it at a rational level. And, the truth or the facts, no, thanks, man, don't confuse me.
The facts don't matter.
Facts don't matter.
No, it's pre-rational.
Mm.
Yeah.
And Connie, I want to bring out a couple of things you said that weren't directly, were more general. You mentioned something which I'm sure I must have heard of and thought of, but it was like I'd completely forgotten the incredibly important concept of a cultural shadow, that different cultures will have their own shadows. It's like the light bulbs went off. And you pointed to the American myth of the independent person.
Yes.
Self-made person. And of course, the shadow of that will be dependency. It never occurred to me. So thank you. I mean, another blinding insight into the totally obvious.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And you remind me of the great psychoanalyst, Erich Fromm, who wrote a book, The Escape from Freedom. And Eric Becker, who wrote on the denial of death, the way we want to give our power away and just find salvation in someone else.
Yes, 2 really important books. Yes.
Yeah. Very helpful. Very helpful. Thank you so much.
And I think salvation is an important word, Roger, here, which carries many different meanings depending on our tradition. But yes, it's so much about salvation. And I'm wondering, as people are listening, I wish we could have a conversation with our listeners about, the associations and the images and the feelings that are coming up. Because some of these words are very charged. They're loaded. And they're loaded in our culture, and they're loaded in our spiritual communities, our subcultures. And some of those, vocabularies in our spiritual subcultures become cult-like. We all start giving the same meaning to certain words, right? And other people don't really know what we're talking about. And I would say, back to our conversation about when it becomes cult-like, a word like salvation can trigger so many different feelings and complexes for people in groups. And it's interesting to try to identify those words in your lineages. Just look, I'm speaking to our listeners. Look at your tradition, your lineages, and what are the words that carry charge for you, that carry meaning, that have a lot of associations? And are all of those associations positive? Are some of them negative? Are they used against you in some way? Is that language used to control you in some way? Be interesting to take a look at that with people.
Yeah, and you might also add, for those of us who are listening, as I am now, is there, if you have an organization or a teacher where there's no honorable way to leave or to move on, you know, that is a huge warning flag.
No exit.
Yeah. And I love the phrase. I may even have come up with it, but quite possible I just unconsciously plagiarized it from someone else. That a good cults are easy to get into and hard to get out of. A good spiritual community is hard to get in and easy to get out of.
Ah,
Beautiful.
Oh, I hadn't heard that. Hard to get into and easy to get out of. That's great, Roger. Yeah.
And speaking communities, I want to ask you to comment on some of the recent movements that have started in recognition of the way that shadow elements and other unsavory elements have played themselves out. In the spiritual world, there's, for example, the Association for Spiritual Integrity, which has grown up, and I think you're connected with, and is a group of a community of people and teachers organizing to provide ethical standards, etc. And in the culture at large, the best known is the Me Too movement, which has just took off. Was it 2017? I'd love to have you comment on these movements that have arisen.
Well, I'm actually teaching a workshop for Association for Spiritual Integrity this month. But we won't be broadcasting by then, I think. It's in April, yeah. So, the Me Too movement focused on the workplace and universities, Hollywood, and really was focused on sexual assault and coercion. And it's had actually a huge impact on the culture, even though it's not spoken of now. Certain laws have changed, even in Congress among staffers, laws about harassment have changed. Non-disclosure policies have changed. Numbers of high-profile people have gone to prison around it. We all have heard about that. It really wasn't extended into the spiritual arena in any formal public conversation. But all that kind of emerged from that applies here to our conversation and to this phenomenon that we're talking about. And I think, so for example, the idea of consent, what is consent in the workplace if a supervisor or a manager has someone, a man or woman's financial well-being under their control? Can there be consent? And in the spiritual arena, if a teacher has someone's spiritual well-being under their control, can there be consent? And so this conversation, I think, has expanded from earlier dialogues around feminism and patriarchy, which are still important and still apply. But now what I want to say is there's a kind of a nuance around this issue, I think, in spiritual communities. And that is that some of the women I interviewed really feel like they consent.
I'm sorry,
Consciously,
I couldn't hear that, Connie.
some of the women I interviewed really believe that they consent.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the relationships have ended up in marriage
Yeah.
with a teacher and a student. So how do you evaluate that? I mean, who is to say that there is a predator and a victim? Who is to say that?
Mm.
So, but of course, we don't know. It'd be interesting to follow up those marriages and find out what the power dynamics are like in them. That would be really great to know, but we don't know that. So I think that the complexity of this question of consent, which has been around for a long time, became more conscious in the public arena through Me Too, especially around Hollywood, and how many women lost their acting careers around, sexual manipulation. In the spiritual arena, what are the differences? What are the distinctions to be made? How do we really finally discriminate this? If a female student is devoted to a male teacher, it's not like a workplace situation. In some ways it is. The power dynamic is similar, but in some ways it's very different. What if the teacher claims celibacy to the public and the sexuality is secret? And there are many instances of that in the book that kind of broke my heart in my research. What if the teacher is not celibate, but married and still having sexual relations with students? What if the teacher is not celibate or married and, going for sex with students? What differences do those things make? How does the secrecy affect the larger community? And this is one of the reasons I left the TM movement. When I made certain discoveries about the hypocrisy between what was being said and what was being done. And some people don't care. I mean, there are many people who don't care how their teacher's behaving. They only care about his or her consciousness and how that's affecting them. And the behavior is just like in the background to them. It doesn't matter. So this is really complex, and it's hard in some ways to even call it abuse. I think we can call it abuse when there are traumatic consequences of, PTSD and so forth, and we can clearly say it's abuse. When they're children, obviously, it's a different situation. And
when there's coercion of any kind.
Yes, I had it, but Roger, what's coercion? That's the thing.
Well, yeah, okay, it gets subtle. Yes.
It gets really subtle,
Yeah. I mean, and outside the spiritual arena, I mean, in any relationship, what's coercion? I mean, it's these, and that's one of the things I love about your book. You bring this kind of nuance to the investigation and the recognition that these things are more tricky and subtle than we usually recognize, and certainly more tricky and subtle than the headlines advertise.
Right, that's right. It's not black and white. And it triggers an identity crisis, which the headlines don't talk about. Who am I? If I have sex with my guru, my swami, my roshi, and I keep it a secret from my community, who am I? Am I a victim? Am I a consort? Am I a special one? Is he going to marry me? Am I abused? A victim? So who am I? And that identity crisis has lots of ripple effects, I think, across our spiritual work, across our capacity to deepen our identity into our spiritual nature. because then we're struggling with all these grosser level identities.
Yeah. And Connie, I realize you have to go in a few minutes, but there's one tricky question I really want to throw in, and that is, of the movements which have arisen, the Me Too is the best known, of course, and had, as you said, an enormous impact and very beneficial impact. What's the shadow side of that movement?
I haven't really thought about that. Because there are always two sides of the same story, because there's always a Rashomon, subjective reality in every situation, we could risk getting into, just as we used to blame the victim, we used to blame the women who made accusations, we could flip and get into blaming the abusers in an automatic way. I'm talking about our collective psyche. We could flip into blaming men. We used to blame women.
Or that how about this one, that all men are rapists and all men are guilty,
Yeah, so we could fall into stereotyping and projection, because so many people are not able to hold the complexity of these situations and what's happening in these situations. There are so many spiritual teachers, I believe, who are lonely.
Yes.
They're
yes.
isolated. They're isolated on their thrones. They don't have peer groups to talk to, and they can't be collegial with their students, and so they try to find intimacy in inappropriate ways. So we miss that piece if we instantly blame, if we don't look for the underlying causes and motivations, or the systemic causes, the way that the community or the institution is created, like the Catholic Church. I mean, the Catholic Church is a perfect example of how it's not going to change after they've paid out billions of dollars and, tried to correct it, unless they change the institutions and the whole way the thing is set up, right? So I think that there are risks of black and white thinking and risks of projection and stereotyping, as John said. And so we want to practice shadow awareness. We want to practice holding our insights and the consequences of our insights and the complexities of them. And to do that, we need both psychological practice and spiritual practice.
Yeah. And again, I just so much appreciate your emphasis on the many perspectives that can be taken, the nuances, and the importance of trying, and we all have our limits, holding the complexities and not immediately rushing to assumptions and judgments and stereotypes, etc. Those are psychological mechanisms which are easy to fall into, and part of psychological growth and part of spiritual growth is an increased capacity for stepping back, for taking time, for reflecting, for appreciating multiple points of view and subtleties.
Yes.
So I think so many of the things you've emphasized, Connie, are themselves both the means to and the result of the kind of practices and work we're seeking, and they're very beautiful. I realize you have to go, and I thought maybe this just occurred to me. I think I'd like to close by reading the blurb I gave for your book. Like all of us, I get lots of requests for books, and most of them I try to ignore. But yours, of course, I have to ignore. I can't read them all. But yours, I really wanted to. I loved, and I really wanted to support, and I know and value you and your work so much. So, and what I wrote, I think, is an appropriate summary of some aspects of the book. Many of us fondly imagined that spiritual practice would do it all, that with enough meditation or yoga, we would swiftly awaken to abiding love and light. But then we ran into problems, ourselves and our shadows, those powerful inner dimensions and dynamics that remain unconscious, but can overwhelm and humble us. These shadow dynamics are best recognized and healed with the help of wise friends, counselors, and guides. People like Connie Zweig, a master guide and illuminator of the shadow, our inner world, and the spiritual path. Connie, thank you so much for the work and for this beautiful book, Meeting the Shadow and the Spiritual Path. And it's been a delight to have you back with us.
Thank you. Charles.
And you're a gifted writer too. I had to put in the plug. Your writing doesn't get in the way in the important stuff they're trying to say. It illuminates it and draws the reader in. It's really good stuff.
Thank you both so much.
Such a joy having you back. Thank you, Connie.